lot of things that we actually talk to you about around negotiations that speak to how to prepare and how to learn more about your negotiating partner. And yes, the choice of words is quite deliberate. These are your negotiating partners because what everybody has in common, and I think this gets forgotten sometimes, is that we all want to solve the problem, don't we? So one of the staff that I have an amazing staff, by the way, said, can you just give us some tips about talking during negotiations? And I said, okay. She says, as a matter of fact, it would be really cool if they were very, very short things so that you could tell us what to do and then sort of demonstrate. And that would be that for each tip. And since in the Leadership Driven Project Management Academy, we like to keep consistent, 3 tips. Tip number 1, remember that when you make a statement and they don't contradict you, that doesn't mean that they agreed with you. So sometimes rather than say this, and it's a statement and it's full of conviction, maybe it's not a bad idea to ask it as a question instead, open-ended as possible. So for example, we recently had the remarkable, and I can't believe we are surviving an experience of having 3 house closings in less than a quarter. A little unnerving, true, and it's barely less than a quarter, by the way. And throughout the process, there's always going to be areas where negotiations are going to come up. And so one of the things that I learned was the assumption that silence means assent can be deadly. As an example, when we were closing my little house, one of the things that we took as assent was when we said, okay, so Ron, this is broom clean. That's a phrase they use here in Illinois. I'd never heard it before. For the state that things have to be in order for you to pass it from owner to buyer. And he didn't say no. So we figured that meant yes. Turns out not so much. And that afternoon, instead of settling in to have a nice celebratory glass of wine, we ended up trundling down and getting rid of an 8-piece patio set that the new owners took great exception to. Honestly, I hadn't actually seen it. My partner had. He'd spoken to the agent. I was there when he spoke to the agent, and my agent didn't say no. Of course, the thing is, he didn't say yes either. So sometimes, even when you've changed it to a question, it's not enough. What you might want to do is keep in mind that discussion is going to be facilitated best with an open question. So instead of asking, this is broom ready, right? Maybe the question we should have asked, is there anything else that we need to do to get it to broom ready, broom clean? You know, I actually can't remember what it is now. I think it's broom clean. Apparently an 8-piece patio set that they didn't like, and neither did my former tenant, that wasn't considered meeting conditions. So again, rather than making a statement, ask a question. Rather than asking any old question, make it an open-ended question. Tip number 2 will be coming up shortly. Tip number 2, walk away only when you're willing to stay away. Now, we often get little hints when we go travel internationally to countries where bargaining is just expected. Paying full price for anything in any of the markets is considered bad form. But you see, walking away from a $50 hand-carved wine rack is one thing. You can probably find another one. But depending on what you're negotiating in a project environment, not such a good idea necessarily. Now, absolutely have your points established, have your boundaries established so that you know when a deal is simply no longer good for you. That'll help you decide whether or not you're willing to stay away, so that if you end up having to walk away, it's a considered decision. It's not the kind of decision that should be made because somebody at the negotiating table is getting on your last frayed nerve, and that'll happen. Even if it's a virtual table and the negotiating table is actually, 80 miles long, it can still be kind of irritating and it can still be a little frightening. So remember, tip number 2 is only walk away when you're willing to stay away. And the decision to do so has been thoughtfully considered, and you know what your next step is for the alternative to this negotiated agreement. Tip number 3 is one that when I say it, you're going to think to yourself, well, duh, of course not. And yet, sometimes in the middle of a negotiation, we actually forget this. So here it is. Remember, they're not you and you're not them. So at any point in time, when you're trying to figure out what a response will be to anything that you propose, or you're trying to do a little bit of prep work and you realize you don't know as much about that person as you would like to, don't assume that because of the way you might handle the situation, even if you don't know much about the other individual, well, that's the way any reasonable human being would handle it. I know this is odd, but people have different ideas about what reasonable really means. Be prepared for that. It also is a nice cue to your brain to remember, gosh, we don't know about that. So worst case scenario, it could go here. Best case scenario, it could go here. Somewhere in between is where it's most likely to go, but at least you start establishing ranges, boundaries of what the possibilities are in this negotiation. Because any discussion is going to be a discussion. It's going to be a conversation. It's not going to be you telling that other individual or those other individuals how they're going to react. And expecting that you can predict that accurately when you don't know an awful lot about your negotiating partner can be devastating to the momentum of the negotiation because it can throw you off and it can send a very, very bad signal to the other team. So remember, you're not them and they're not you. And so try to establish a range of possible reactions to any of the suggestions that you plan to make or any of the exploratory questions that you plan to ask. There they are. 3 tips for how to handle the talking part of negotiations. But before we leave, I'd like to point out one more thing. Talking is absolutely important. Asking questions is a wonderful tool for negotiations or, frankly, any conversation. And that means to remember to value listening. Knowing what to say, knowing maybe what not to say, very important. I agree. Remembering to listen, just as important, possibly even a little more important. Because if there's one thing that you can safely assume, it's this. Go into every single negotiation conversation with level 3 listening at the ready. Pay attention, kick in a little metacognition, and truly listen. This video was brought to you by Leadership Driven Project Management Academy. And while we like to stress leadership driven project management, remember, we also have videos out there on risk, on quality, on communications plans and interdependencies, otherwise known as portfolio management in some places. We look forward to having you join us. If you like our approach and you like the information and the suggestions you're getting, please forward it to a couple of colleagues. Like or subscribe. I've got to ask Vicki where those buttons are. And we look forward to seeing you again sometimes. Thanks for joining us.